All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our first speaker series presentation of 2023. My name is Kylie Brightsman, and I am currently the committee chair for our speaker series here at the League of Women Voters Moscow. Today's presentation is entitled Taking Action on Education Funding in Idaho, and our presenters include League members from throughout the state who have joined us today. They are serving on the League of Women Voters of Idaho's Legislative Action Committee, some of whom have been participating in League studies on education funding since 2015. We also have representatives from the group TOADS, which stands for Totally Dedicated Advocates Dedicated to Students, and also on hand to explain how they used a League study to develop bills that they are currently promoting in the Idaho Legislature. This presentation will include some currently proposed legislation and how to give input to legislators, which is very relevant for this being Education Week in our state legislature. If you have questions for our speakers, please type them in the chat. The chat is located at the bottom of the screen if you are on a computer or laptop, or on the menu if you're on your phone or a tablet. And you can type it in there and click enter, and then we'll all be able to see the questions, and I'll moderate and read those questions for our Q&A at the end of the presentations. As you can see on your screen already, the presenters will be sharing slides on the screen. So if the slides are not showing up properly on your end, what you can do is click on View Options at the top of your screen. You'll see a little arrow, and switch the view to Fit to Window so that it fits to the window of your screen. And if you're having any other issues, put them in the chat, and I'll be monitoring throughout our discussion today. So we have a lot of content to cover. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you, Kylie. The League of Women Voters of Idaho has a long history of comprehensive studies, consensus-derived official positions, and citizen action related to education funding in Idaho. I'm Kathy Dawes, and I want to thank those listed on this slide for working with me to gather the information we will be sharing. If you have any questions, as Kylie said, please put them in the chat when you think of them so you don't forget, and we'll answer them at the end. We plan to accomplish three things in this presentation: present how the League conducts studies, an example of how information from two such studies has been used, and how you can take action to inform decision-making by legislators. League members select studies and conduct them by gathering lots of information. Once a study is complete, consensus is derived from member discussions. About 8 years ago, League members conducted a comprehensive study of education funding in Idaho that included all the references listed here. As the result of the study, they made several recommendations that included a number of actions, including a comprehensive list of sales tax exemptions that should be eliminated. This list is still being used by advocates for sales tax reform. This is the most recent addition to our official League of Women Voters of Idaho positions related to education funding. The comprehensive study looked closely at the revenue sources for education, including the two largest sources of general fund revenue, income and sales taxes. The position also recommends tax reforms, such as restoring personal and corporate taxes indexed to income, reducing the number of sales tax exemptions, effectively equalizing school funding. This year, the study is being updated with recent information that we're presenting here. It has become clear to League members and other advocates that action is needed immediately to increase education funding in Idaho. This action would include reforming tax policies that affect the state's general revenue fund, the major source of education funding. Our Idaho Constitution states that this duty of the legislature as given here. And the phrase to maintain a general, uniform, and thorough system is well known in the advocacy community. But here I draw your attention to the rationale of the writers of this section. That is, the stability of a Republican form of government depending mainly upon the intelligence of the people. The League of Women Voters believes that sustainable self-governance requires the participation of informed voters. That has always been central to our mission. The Idaho Supreme Court has ruled that the legislature has not met this obligation for many years. In a 1990 case, Robert Huntley was the lead attorney for a group of Idaho school districts that sued the state over its system for funding school construction, leading to decades of litigation in the Idaho Supreme Court and a 2005 ruling that the current system is unconstitutional. The court ruled that, quote, a system over-reliant on local property taxes is by its very nature an arbitrary system that can never be totally thorough. There are many measurable indicators that the legislature has not fulfilled its constitutional duty. One important indicator is what has happened with supplemental levies around the state, which are paid by property owners through their property taxes. At the same time, the state is asking property owners to pay more for public schools. It's making it more expensive to own property. Supplemental levy amounts have been dramatically increasing for the past 26 years, as shown in the graph on the left. So you can see how the trend is going. Also, more and more of the 115 school districts in the state have had to rely on supplemental levies, as shown in the graph on the right, a similar trend. Here is an example of how the supplemental levy in this particular community impacts a family's property tax bill. For a modest residence, virtually 1/3 of the property tax bill, a total of $650.90, is paying for the local supplemental levy for schools. This home is owned by retirees. If they can't pay their taxes and they don't qualify for tax relief, they may lose their home. Property taxes do not affect all properties in the same way. This graph shows how changes in tax policy have shifted the relative proportions of property tax collection from commercial to residential property, with the gap widening between the two classifications. Residential property owners, the top blue line on the graph, have increasingly had to pay higher taxes than any other types of property owners, such as commercial, public utilities, agricultural, timber, and mining property owners. This becomes a matter of fairness and another reason to reform the state's tax policies. Additional inequities are due to the fact that local districts have significantly different amounts of taxable property, resulting in vastly differing amounts of revenue they can count on due to each community's capacity to pay, even when using the exact same levy rate. For example, if you look at this sample of school districts, the column labeled valuation is the value of property in that district that can be taxed. Going down the list, you can see how these numbers vary greatly from district to district. The enrollment numbers in the next column also vary widely. When the valuation is divided by enrollment, you get a value per student amount, which also obviously varies greatly between districts. The two districts highlighted in yellow are examples of two very different school districts, showing that even if each of these districts passed a 0.003 property tax levy, which is 0.3% of the average property value in the district, the levy amount per student in Snake River would only be $587, while that in Blaine County would be $12,789. In the past, the state smoothed out the differences in per pupil funding across districts through an equalization process. However, that process no longer exists. To address growing staffing concerns and operating costs, a number of Idaho's public school districts and charter schools plan to shorten their instruction weeks and are switching to a 4-day school week. Currently, 81 school districts and charter schools are planning to offer 4 days of school per week. While the national average K-12 teacher salary varies significantly by state, Idaho's public school teacher salaries currently rank around 40th in the nation. The pay gap is a big factor in the shortages we are experiencing of qualified K-12 teachers that's affecting every school district in Idaho. The Census Bureau and the National Education Association have reported that since at least 2013, Idaho's per pupil spending has ranked either 50th or 51st in the nation if you count Washington, D.C. In addition to the previously mentioned indicators of inadequate funding of public schools, the legislature learned a year ago, January 22, that an evaluation of public schools done by the Office of Performance Evaluation revealed that nearly $1 billion would be required to bring all schools up to good condition. The Idaho Constitution mandates that the state must provide for safe schools. The vast majority of school districts depend on passing bonds and plant facilities levies to fund new schools and pay for building maintenance. Both bonds and levies require property tax increases. From 2011 to 2020, a majority of bonds have failed. The public is resisting bonds because of ever higher property taxes. Property owners are being squeezed and are increasingly angry. In addition to the problems mentioned earlier with property taxes being used heavily for education funding, especially in some school districts, there are policy changes that have affected state funding for education that comes from the General Revenue Fund. The primary revenue sources for the fund are income tax revenue and sales tax revenue. Let's look at income tax rates. This graph shows what has happened to the average income tax rate for individuals since 1972. It's been going down steadily. On the right is a description of what has happened to the income tax rate for businesses and corporations. These tax rates have been reduced 3 times in the last 3 years. The other major source of state funding is from sales tax revenue that, like income tax revenue, flows into the General Revenue Fund. In 1965, a 3% sales tax specifically for the purpose of funding public education was overwhelmingly approved by Idaho voters. At that time, only a small number of products were exempt from this sales tax. Since then, however, the number of sales tax exemptions has increased more than 5-fold. The League's study recommended leaving in place the current exemptions connected to medical care, education, heating, churches, tribes, donations, and governments, but eliminating several others. Also, since 1966, Idaho's previously product-based economy has changed gradually to mostly a service-based economy. However, services are not taxed. In 2007, a legislative interim committee on tax exemptions was formed that drew up some principles for evaluating exemptions, but that was the extent of their efforts. Although Governor Little recently recommended these increases in education funding, it is actually the legislature that will make the final decisions. Public input will be key in this decision-making process. The governor's proposal includes $52.4 million in funds districts can use at their discretion to meet local needs and defray costs to property owners. Money may be used to make improvements to district facilities, but again, they're coming from one-time funding. However, as indicated earlier, the Office of Performance Evaluation report indicated that more than $840 million is actually needed to bring district buildings up to good condition. Along come the toads, the totally optimistic advocates dedicated to students. A group composed of about 30 members, including former Idaho Supreme Court Justice Robert Huntley, who is here with us today, former Idaho Superintendent of Public Instruction Jerry Evans, former Boise School District Superintendent Don Coberly, former Nampa School District Superintendent and one-time West Ada School Board member Russell Yoki, former Representative Shirley Ringo, and League of Women Voters of Idaho President Betsy McBride, who is also here today, among other education advocates. The Toads agreed with many of the League's findings and worked toward a comprehensive solution to the education funding problem, which they feel is largely due to the need for, quote, a bigger pie, as described in this quote from Robert Huntley. According to the Toads, their own analysis revealed that they determined that public schools have actually been underfunded by a total of about $1.3 billion every year. This total includes the cost of free full-day kindergarten, K-12 funding needs, as determined by Mike Ferguson, former Idaho chief economist in the Office of the Governor, the cost of covering current supplemental levies, which is the amount shown here, and higher ed funding needs as determined by Dr. Bob Kustra, former president of Boise State University. The Toads have written 2 bills that address many of the current concerns discovered by the League through our studies. The first bill would provide immediate funding for education, while the second would provide ongoing funding if it's passed by Idaho voters on a citizens' advisory ballot. The first bill proposes to create a special restricted fund for the purposes shown here. It addresses the need for salary increases, property tax relief, and funds to help with facilities. The second bill would do several things. It would reduce the number of sales tax exemptions. It would change sales tax on some services and would allow for an overall reduction in the state sales tax from the current 6% down to 4%, and would actually result in a large increase in additional general fund revenue. The idea is to lower the overall sales tax rate for all of us but collect that tax revenue from a broader base. Since most services are not linked to basic needs, taxing services will have less effect on lower income families and will broaden the tax base and provide revenue stability. This bill will actually result in a bigger pie. These proposed bills offer an example of how the efforts of thoughtful groups of people like the League of Women Voters and TOADS have involved research to develop a comprehensive possible solution to our state's education funding needs. Although there is not complete agreement between the two groups on details, we feel that this is a starting point for discussions that should be taking place among citizens and in the legislature. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Jean Henscheid, who will describe how all of us can use the information to take action. Jean?
Thank you, Kathy. As Kathy said, I'm Jean Henscheid, a career educator who cares deeply about our state and our students. I'm a proud member of the League of Women Voters because we carefully research an issue before we write a position. We then use that position to thoughtfully craft action steps on legislation related to an issue. Let me back up just a little bit and have Kathy talk about some alternatives to that are being proposed by members of the legislature. Alternatives for education funding.
Oops, I had to unmute myself. Sorry about that. Some legislators are planning to introduce legislation this session that would provide funds for enhanced savings accounts similar to vouchers, which would provide parents with funds they could use to pay for educational expenses, including tuition for public, private, or religious schools. Second item here is the Empowering Parents Grants that were established with federal funding during the pandemic to allow parents to apply for and receive $1,000 per child, up to $3,000 per family, to pay for such things as supplies, computers, internet access, instructional materials and services, and tutoring. Those federal funds will likely be used up by the end of this year. So if this program continues as Governor Little has recommended, it will have to be paid for by additional state funds. The League of Women Voters of Idaho does not have an official position on these proposed alternatives. That said, the League does not support any program that diverts funding away from public education. Okay. On this slide are links to two presentations that were made during the first week of the legislative session, one pro and one con, regarding ESAs, that is educational savings accounts, and vouchers. And the links to these are going, I think Kylie has already put them in the chat. So if you want to copy and paste them into another document, you can do that. And now, Jean will, who is co-chair of our Legislative Action Committee, will encourage all members of the League and members of the public to take action.
All right, there we go. Okay. So in terms of those last two alternatives to educational funding, apparently this week is really gearing up in terms of proponents of these proposals. So now is the time to act. And so why act? Education funding is one of the most important issues the legislature will tackle this year and every year. The state is apparently flush with money to make real improvements to education funding, or divert it, as we've seen, to other purposes. They need to know what their constituents think. Half of this year's legislature is new. Nearly half is new. They and all legislators need good information to make good, informed decisions. The legislature needs to hear from as many people as possible. The key is quality and quantity of communication. And of course, legislators listen first to voters in their own districts. So how can you get involved? I'll walk you through some of the steps that we can take to give input to legislators. Something you can do starting tomorrow, if you're not already doing. I have a hunch that most of the people in this meeting are actually already watching committees. Every Idaho citizen concerned about education funding should be watching for bills to appear in legislative committee hearings related to this topic. Committees are where every idea starts and either moves on or dies. The job of people who care about the legislative process is to choose which committee we wish to watch and commit to spending at least a few hours a week seeing how the sausage is made. As soon as our presentation is done, please bookmark, I don't even need to tell you this, you've already done it, legislature.idaho.gov, where you can, on your couch, watch live or download committee hearings. For education funding, 4 committees are the most important: Senate Education, House Education, Revenue and Taxation in the House, and the Joint Finance-Appropriations Committee, or JFAC. I typically watch the recording of the 8 a.m. JFAC and then the 9 a.m. House Education Committee. And then I watch those as recorded rather than getting up at 8 or 9. I'm apologizing. And then I watch the Senate Education Committee live. That way I don't feel like I'm chewing up my entire day watching the legislature. It also gives me a weird sense of control, being able to stop and start some committees when I need a breather from this action. I'm sure that you discovered that too as legislative committee watchers. What am I primarily watching for? The RS, meaning routing slip. I call these baby bills because they have not yet been approved for printing or to receive a bill number. In the beginning of the legislature, many members will be eager to present their own baby bills, typically on issues that were at the center of their campaigns. We're seeing that right now. RSs are interesting to read, but until they're approved to receive a bill number, they're just ideas. Their sponsors or co-sponsors are floating to their fellow lawmakers. There's no public testimony with baby bills, as they are still an RS. Fortunately, the League of Women Voters of Idaho usually has conducted enough research on RS-related topics to know whether the ideas have legs and whether it will support or oppose any bill that comes forward on the issue. If the League chooses to act, we help each other in crafting messages with impact. Any member of the public is encouraged to watch for RSs, determine whether you wish to take action, and then act. One other way League members and the general public can take action is to talk with our friends and neighbors about issues that matter. Yes, I know, politics and religion are things you aren't supposed to talk about, but the stakes for educational funding are just too flippin' high. League members are committed to engage in informed civil discourse. We work to see all sides of an issue and we use evidence to support positions. Our goal is to model such behavior for others. Other ways to take action include following the news, of course. For this, we give a particular shout out to Idaho Education News, the Idaho Capital Sun, local newspapers, Idaho Reports on PBS, and public radio for keeping us up to date on activities in the legislature. Paid public announcement for PBS. Everyone can also sign up for the legislative alerts on the relevant committee web pages and find out if your local legislator has a newsletter you can subscribe to. The most important people, or one set of the most important people in the most important bodies in the legislature, are committee chairs. Here are three that we really are paying most attention to when it comes to education funding. David Lent from Idaho Falls, Chair of Senate Education. Jason Monks, Chair of the House Revenue and Taxation Committee. And Julie Yamamoto from Caldwell, Chair of the House Education Committee. Since so many members and chairs are new to their roles, we have heard that they are eager to hear from constituents, and many are open to informed commentary on upcoming legislation. Equally as important as the committee chairs are the committee secretaries, who are listed on committee websites. These are the people who will connect you to chairs and members of committees to allow you to write emails, schedule face-to-face meetings, write snail mails, and provide in-person and remote testimony on the committees. You should become as familiar with the secretaries of the committees as you are with these august folks who are the committee chairs. If you have a penchant for writing and have something to say, you're encouraged to write letters to editors of local papers. Kathy actually is quite good at this. Submit guest editorials or post to social media. League members and any member of the public is welcome to use the League's research to build a case to support education funding. A copy of this PowerPoint, as Kathy mentioned and Kylie mentioned, will be available on the League of Women Voters of Moscow website, as well as League of Women Voters of Idaho sites. If you're ready to testify before a legislative committee, as Kendall has done for many years, as has Eleanor and Betsy, there are many of us available to help you with this task. It actually feels very daunting, but it's fun, and it actually is very rewarding. Pictured are just a few of those who have experience and would be willing to help. Please just ask. Since the pandemic, constituents from throughout the state have been able to offer remote testimony. And in fact, Kathy Dawes was the very first person to provide testimony remotely in the state legislature. You can come to the State House and testify in person. We hear over and over what a tremendous impact well-prepared, respectful testimony has on committee deliberations, and cannot encourage you strongly enough to testify on behalf of yourself and your family. The real worker bees of the League of Women Voters of Idaho, in terms of the legislature, is the Legislative Action Committee. They keep us up to date on the legislature. They meet once a week, and members are assigned committees to watch and tasks to perform throughout the week. These volunteers deserve a shout out for being the League's legislative eyes and ears. Because of their work, we know where our energy is best spent and which topics warrant future study. Oops. If you'd like more information, including suggestions for how to write and present testimony that has the greatest impact, we have listed 2 links to videos on this topic. One is just 10 minutes long, and another is more comprehensive. These videos will take you step by step through the process of checking for bills and registering to testify either in person or remotely. These links have already been entered in the chat if you'd like to copy and paste them. Also, I've included email addresses so you can contact either Kendall Shaver, co-chair of the Legislative Action Committee, or myself, Jean Henscheid, if you want help with these. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy to summarize what we've said and what we've done, and to open this up for discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jean. In this presentation, we planned to accomplish these three things, and I hope we succeeded. We used recent taxation and education studies to demonstrate how the League develops positions based on exhaustive research. We offered proposed legislation from TOADS as an example of turning research into action. And finally, we made suggestions on how League members and other members of the public can and should take action. Thank you so much for attending our presentation and for considering to take action on education funding in Idaho.